Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Donna Martinez. Welcome to another edition of Shaftesbury Society, coming to you live from Midtown Raleigh, here at the headquarters of the John Locke Foundation. Well, the political season is underway. I know it's hard to believe. It's kind of like, did we finish off the last one already anyway? Still discussion about 2020, but 2022 is here. So a lot of questions now are looming over U.S. Census data, the redrawing of districts here in North Carolina, even when or if municipal elections will be held in our state. And of course, the question that has been on the docket for years now, whether or not North Carolina will require a photo ID to vote. Now, what we do know about this election season is that where Republicans are in control in this state, the Democrats are eyeing a takeover. Where Democrats are in control in this state, the Republicans are ready for battle. And then the big question we always look at, what about those folks in the middle, the unaffiliateds? What are they thinking? We're going to be discussing all of this today as we head into the 2022 and 2024 election seasons. We got a great panel lined up for you. Joining us today, Dr. Michael Bitzer. He is professor of politics and history at Catawba College. Brad Crone, our friend here, he's been with us before for Shaftesbury Society. He is a principal with Campaign Connections. And my Locke Foundation colleague, Dr. Andy Jackson. Andy is director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity, located here at the Locke Foundation. Gentlemen, thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Yeah. Professor, let's start with you. What's on your mind about this new election season?
Well, I always tell my students, as soon as you finish one election, determine the winners, the next election cycle starts. So yes, indeed, it feels like it's deja vu all over again, but we're just continuously in an election cycle. This year, coming into 2022, midterm elections, I think for political scientists, we know some basic fundamentals. Midterms tend to be referendums on the party in power, particularly the party in the White House. And so the question in my mind is, how much of an influence will Joe Biden have? What will the economy be like? How will COVID be either still being dealt with or perhaps in the rearview mirror? And I think generally what we know is that presidents do tend to lose seats in Congress. There are some exceptions, and we can certainly talk more about those dynamics later on. But I think here in North Carolina, what I'll be looking at is probably one of the key national Senate races, and that's the U.S. Senate race. Along with states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina is going to be at the top of the list in terms of the battle, particularly for an open seat. And then I think with the House, U.S. House of Representatives, what will redistricting bring, and then what lawsuits will inevitably be filed afterwards? I think that, for the past 40 years, North Carolina has experienced a lawsuit either at the federal or the state level over redistricting, congressional and state legislative. So I think that that's probably a pattern that we're going to fall into as well. And then the other is indeed turnout. Who will be showing up next year, and what will be their motivation, their impetus to show up to vote? We generally see a drop off in turnout, but we've got two highly competitive primaries for the U.S. Senate that will drive a lot of the dynamics that I'm going to be watching for. And then finally, probably the big unknown, when will registered unaffiliated voters take over registered Democrats as the largest bloc? As of Saturday, they're about 105,000 behind registered Democrats. They likely will hit and go beyond that in terms of next year's November election. So I think the dynamics are always there. Just because they're registered unaffiliated doesn't necessarily mean they are politically independent.
Yeah, that's a fascinating subject all in and of itself. Brad, what are you watching?
Well, I think it's always difficult to follow Dr. Bitzer because he's still on the talking points, but he's absolutely right. Two absolutely dynamic primaries for the United States Senate. This is the first time that I can remember that we've had an open United States Senate seat, probably going all the way back to 2002, when that seat was open. Elizabeth Dole was elected. The dynamics of watching the primary, just from last week where the president came in at the Republican GOP convention in Greenville and announced that he was going to play in the race supporting Congressman Ted Budd versus Mark Walker and Pat McCrory. What happened after that, 2/3 of the crowd left somewhat disappointed because their candidate had not been supported. The dynamics of watching the ultra-right and the conservative right and then the rest of the party, how that is going to play out is very intriguing. On the opposite end of the aisle, the Democrat primary with Sherry Beasley clearly the front runner, Jeff Jackson probably in second place, Erica Smith, and then Rhett Newton. Rhett Newton has a great profile. He just doesn't have a base from which to run there in Carteret County. Erica Smith, the rumor that is floating around Raleigh is that she will probably end up running for Congress. It is highly likely that G.K. Butterfield, the congressman from North Carolina 1st Congressional District, will likely get an ambassador appointed position as an ambassador. There's been a lot of rumors and reports and speculation that GK is going to be named as the ambassador for a major country in Africa. So if that seat opens up, I would fully expect to see Erica Smith transition over into that 1st Congressional District. The other thing, I think Dr. Bitzer is absolutely right. The movement of the unaffiliated voter is really going to play an important role in all our elections next year. And remember in 2018, we had about a 50% turnout. I expect you'll continue to see that. I did a focus group 2 weeks ago. I witnessed one in Charlotte with unaffiliated voters from your horseshoe counties. So from Union County, Cabarrus County, Iredell, Rowan, Lincoln, and Gaston County. And it was truly fascinating. The unaffiliated voter, they like Joe Biden because they wanted some decompression from Trump, but they're scared of the people around Joe Biden as being too liberal and out of step with their values and that they see are important values for them here in North Carolina. With that said, they gave the Republicans in the state legislature very high marks. They say the Republicans do an excellent job of managing the state's money. They are opposed to Medicaid expansion. They are concerned about the unionization of education in the classroom through the NCAE. They want school choice, the unaffiliated voters do, and they want more money spent on roads and infrastructure in the Charlotte area. So it was absolutely fascinating hearing the input of these voters. And the suburban voters in the wraparound counties and the 3 metropolitan markets will be driving the election as we go forward at the federal level and at the state level. And lastly, Donna, redistricting. I fully anticipate a new congressional district in Cleveland, Gaston, Lincoln, and North Mecklenburg County. I think that redistricting will also probably see Republican supermajorities again for the state Senate and the state House.
Wow, that's a fascinating landscape that you've described there. And Brad, just one thought, we could talk a little bit about this later, but what you're describing about the unaffiliateds that you were talking with or witnessing there in that focus group tracks a bit with the May Civitas poll, in which the Civitas pollsters found that nearly 6 of 10 North Carolina voters likely to cast a ballot in 2022 expressed concern that the Biden administration would do too much to increase the size and role of government. And that included 27% of Democrats and 56% of unaffiliated voters, of course, 97% of Republicans. But I always thought that was a very interesting data point from that Civitas poll. Even 27% of Democrats had that concern essentially about where Biden would go. And to your point about people being comfortable with him, but the people around him not so much. So that is fascinating. Andy Jackson, I know that you have been watching a lot of the dynamics of the General Assembly as it relates to election law and election integrity. And Andy, I know that you have several specific items that you're watching really carefully that you're going to update us on. So Andy, I'd like to turn the floor over to you to give us your thoughts on what's happening in North Carolina.
Okay, and I actually have the advantage of having visuals, so I can remember everything I want to say here. So in addition to the ongoing lawsuits about ID, there are several factors that are going to be affecting the election as soon as, there we go. So the first thing we have is, we got to remember there are some changes that were made to election law in the 2020 cycle that are changing back. They had sunset clauses built into the law. So if you had decided, well, I'm going to get used to this change, well, don't get used to some of these changes because they've already changed back. The first one, and perhaps the biggest one, is that the witness requirement for absentee by mail ballots, last year they reduced it down to 1 just for the 2020 election. It's back up to 2. Also, from an administrative standpoint, there was a worry about there not being enough workers. It'd be hard to recruit workers. That turned out not to be the case. Lots of folks volunteered. We had ample volunteers, but just to make sure, they changed the law temporarily so that they could recruit more of the precinct workers from outside the precinct. We're going back to having a majority of precinct workers having to reside in the precinct. The last thing here that I'll mention in this list is that multi-partisan teams. Now, these are folks that are Republicans and Democrats, or sometimes people with other affiliations that work in teams. They're designed to help people primarily in assisted living facilities make absentee ballot requests, basically smooth the process out for folks that may have a hard time getting in contact with their local county board of elections. Just for last year, they had been authorized to essentially assist anybody. Now they're going back to their primary task of assisting people in assisted living facilities with absentee voting. There's a lot of bills in the General Assembly. We could have an entire show just on all the bills. So I'm just going to quickly highlight a few of them. Probably the single biggest one, certainly the one that's had the most controversy, is Senate Bill 326. It removes the postmark exception to the absentee by mail ballot deadline. Right now, the deadline is election day at 5 o'clock, but in 2009, they changed it so that if it's in the mail stream, if there is a postmark on it of election day, then it can be received up to 3 days after. And actually, it was 9 days because of a lawsuit settlement last year in the last election. This bill would take that back, and North Carolina would rejoin other states that make an election day deadline for the boards to receive absentee ballots. It also requires counties to be a little more diligent in how they're reporting their data. As somebody that watches the daily data come in, you start noticing, like, we've gone several days without any early voting or absentee voting data from some counties. We don't really know exactly, where this is coming from. It certainly causes anxiety for me. It causes anxiety for other people that are trying to figure out what's going on in the election. This is to basically make a requirement of something that is kind of a guideline right now. 724, Senate Bill 724 has several factors. It has setting up an online portal to help visually impaired people go through the voting process. It opens up a portal with the North Carolina State Board of Elections for online voter registration. Right now, we have de facto online voter registration for people that have at least gone once to the North Carolina Department of Motor Vehicles and have signed something. They can actually register or change their registration online through the Department of Motor Vehicles. This bill would add a portal at the State Board of Elections. And there's also a provision that is authorizing an expenditure for helping people to get IDs in order to vote. This is in anticipation, or hope, I guess, of these lawsuits about voter ID being settled in time for the next election. May happen, may not happen, we don't know. But this is authorizing expenditures for that. The next one we hear is Senate Bill 723. This essentially bans so-called Zuck bucks for election administration or hiring personnel. Now, the bill may leave a loophole in there for folks for saying buying equipment, because it doesn't specifically prohibit buying equipment, but for things like administering elections or hiring people, the bill says you have to get that like you normally would through your county board of elections or for the state board from the General Assembly.
And Andy, let me just add one question here on that. Explain what a Zuck Buck is. It's really a private group, and it's a reference to Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg made substantial donations to an organization called, and if I can remember this right, the Center for Tech and Civic Life. I do believe that's it. Several $100 million, and then they awarded grants to counties that requested them to do any number of things, buy equipment, maybe buy personal protective equipment and other things. They're called Zuck Bucks just because Mark Zuckerberg made the biggest donation to this organization. And of course, that is not the only organization. Arnold Schwarzenegger led another organization. There are several out there that had been sending these donations to county boards, not just in North Carolina, but in states all over the United States. Now, Senate Bill 360, which has an equivalent bill in the House, essentially would make it so that if there is a legislative defendant in a lawsuit that deals with law or the North Carolina Constitution, you cannot have a settlement without their agreement. Current law says that they're allowed to be a party, they're allowed to intervene as defendants, but this will tighten that up to where if they are defendants, then any settlement has to be with their agreement. This is primarily as a reaction to a settlement between the Attorney General and the State Board of Elections in a lawsuit last fall, where it altered a couple of pieces of law. The General Assembly leadership tried to intervene, but the judge said, no, we don't have to include you in that. There's a lot more bills. We won't cover them all. A lot of them deal with redistricting, setting up redistricting commissions. The likelihood, I would say it's going to be, all these bills, election bills, are going to be running the gauntlet in one way or another. The Democratic sponsored bills, most of them aren't even going to get a hearing. If they do, they're going to get likely voted down. The Republican bills are likely to pass mostly on a party line vote, with the possible exception of Senate Bill 724. And if that's the case, then they would not survive a veto from Governor Cooper. Another area, and we'll talk about this a lot, I'm sure today, is redistricting. We got reapportionment, as already been mentioned. We're going to gain a 14th seat. There's a lot of open debate about where that's going to go. I know we have at least one state legislature that's really convinced that the new district is going to be based out of Western Wake County. We'll see if that happens or not. Another big issue is the Census Bureau. Normally, we'd already be in the early process of the redistricting, but we have a delay in the data from the Census Bureau. They're expecting to get it out by August 16th. There's kind of an in window of September 30th, but alas, again, there's a lawsuit about that. If the Census Bureau loses that lawsuit, it's dealing with how they handle some of the privacy information in the census, then we could see up to a 6 or 7 month delay in getting the data. And if that happens, then that blows the whole ball game as far as what we're going to do about redistricting. Because right now on our schedule, candidate filing starts on December 6th, and we have a scheduled March 8th primary. I just want to quickly note a couple of lawsuits because, as Professor Bitzer already mentioned, two big ones that are really affecting this is Stevenson versus Bartlett. These districts that I have up here are from the 2001 maps. And I will tell you, under Stevenson versus Bartlett, 23rd, 24th, and 25th districts, if y'all see those numbers, those were all banned because of the way they kind of snake in and out of counties. Now you can still divide counties, but there's a prescribed formula for how you do that. And so it takes away a lot of the creativity. There were a couple of lawsuits last year, Common Cause versus Lewis and Harper versus Lewis, that essentially kind of assigned a macro number to the expected division of legislative seats and congressional seats. And if you get too far beyond that, a couple of standard deviations, if it's a highly unlikely result according to statistical models, that redistricting, to the extent that those cases have precedent, they didn't get to the North Carolina Supreme Court level, but to the extent that they do, that would limit potentially the kind of total result. So you could get, you might have some interesting local districts, but if the total result goes too far in favor of one party, then according to these lawsuits, then those could get thrown out as well. Just a couple more real quick. Election observers. North Carolina, under current law, depending on how you interpret it, you can have 2 observers. Each party can have 2 observers. Basically, they're watching, making sure nothing bad is happening. They report to their counties. They see if there's any activity that they think might be illegal. And there's a debate going on because if you read the law, at least in my reading, and we can discuss this, it looks like at a minimum you could have 4 a day, but no more than 2 at a time. And perhaps at a maximum, depending on your interpretation, up to 8 a day, just no more than 2 at a time every 4 hours. The State Board of Elections is seeking to change their current interpretation of the law to limit it to 2 observers for the entire day. And so there's a big debate going about that. This is probably going to end up going to the Rules Review Commission sometimes this summer, which is a statewide organization that kind of grants or does not grant changes that executive bodies try to make. And finally, municipal elections, we're a little unsure because of that late census data. Some of the cities, the particularly larger ones that use wards or districts, they're not going to have the information they need to update the districts in order to fulfill the 1 person, 1 vote requirement under the law. So under a bill in the Senate, from the Senate, SB 722, those larger places, your Winston-Salems, your Charlottes, your Raleighs, they're going to delay their elections to 2022, coincided with the primary. The vast majority of municipalities, which don't use districts, so they don't really have to worry about that census data, they're still going to have their regular elections at the regular time in 2022. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the background, and we're not going to be fully resolved on this until the fall at the earliest.
Wow, complicated is the word that comes to mind here. And normally for folks who are on the receiving end of that information, voters normally just think, oh, I don't need to understand anything about that. I'm just going to know who the candidates are and then go vote for my candidates. But there's a lot of moving parts here. Let's go ahead and bring back into the conversation Professor Michael Bitzer and Brad Crone. Gentlemen, I'd like to get your reaction to some of the things that Andy has brought up here, but I'd like to start with the issue of all of the rules that govern elections. Just a couple days ago, we had the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, weigh in, making comments saying that he and DOJ are going to be watching a lot of the rules, particularly in Republican-led states where voting laws are being changed. So this not only has an impact on North Carolina, but Washington is going to be watching what this state does.
Well, as you know, historically, Washington has played a really important role since 1965 in North Carolina politics through the Civil Rights Division. I think that will continue simply because there should be no legislation that impedes a citizen's right to participate in the election process, regardless of race, creed, gender, identification. So I applaud the Biden administration for taking the position that even though they don't have a legislative majority here in the state of North Carolina, they are going to be paying attention to access. And I think that's critically important.
Professor, the interesting thing is some people see voting rules or changes to rules as issues of impeding access. Other people say it's simply impeding the ability to cheat, which they say would disenfranchise a legally cast vote. So how do we define that? How do we come to a common decision about what is trying to disenfranchise and what is trying to just shore up the system?
I think all this revolves back around our polarized environment. Partisanship is driving a lot of this. The dynamics of who writes the rules of the game of politics, as I described to my students, is a critical one. As Andy noted, how does the State Board of Elections interpret a word in a statute versus how others interpret it? And I think that this is very much the dynamic. We talk about separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and that goes on nationally, goes on here in the state. But this dynamic of federalism, how much power will Washington, D.C. have, and who is in control there to write the rules of the game versus what is happening in all 50 states and how their rules are being impacted as well. So I think, with the discussion of H.R. 1, with the discussion of a new Voting Rights Act, and all the complications as you defined also earlier going on with that dynamic in Washington, I think this will just continuously be something that those of us who watch it will have to try and make sense of. But again, who has the power to determine what those rules are and how then they are interpreted, how they are framed? Yes, voter fraud can be an issue, but it is not of a significant issue that we know of in terms of the research and the evidence provided. Does that happen? Yes. Is it minuscule? Yes. Are different levels of government going to be trying to define and capture those kinds of dynamics? Certainly. Welcome to politics.
And now it seems to me that there is a new big player in the whole political game over the rules of elections, and that is big business. Now you have the so-called woke businesses weighing in, and I'm a Major League Baseball fan, and I was very surprised to see Major League Baseball say, no, we're not going to play the All-Star game in Atlanta because we don't like the changes to the voting law. So in terms of politics and public perception, is that where the culture is going, or does this actually cut both ways? Do you have people who will get involved, for example, in response to big business saying, hey, we're going to try to have a voice in elections as well?
I think it's a double-edged sword, clearly, Donna. And the business community has to tread very lightly when it comes to these issues because it can backfire on you. One critical element that Dr. Bitzer alluded to previously, in North Carolina, there were 6 million plus ballots cast in the 2020 election. I think there were 13 instances of voter fraud investigated. I'll take those odds any day of the week. So I think the business community has to tread very lightly. As Michael Jordan used to say, they wanted to know why he didn't get involved in politics. He said, Republicans buy tennis shoes too. So it goes back to what Dr. Bitzer said too, is the hyperpolarization that we're seeing in our political engagement today. And that should alarm every single one of us, because getting embedded into burrows and camps and silos is dangerous for American democracy. Our system was set up for compromise. We have to be able to move to compromise and not punish our political leadership who is willing to cut a deal for the betterment of everyone.
Andy,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to jump in and we saw this, the companies, especially companies that say have a headquarters in an area, and I'm sure companies say that are based particularly in Raleigh or Charlotte are going to kind of face these same kind of counter currents. If you say something about local politics, you're going to get a backlash. I mean, almost guaranteed. However, if you don't say something, you will start receiving pressure as well. So these corporate leaders are not in an enviable position as far as what they say or if they say anything that may affect local politics. And so, yeah, it's easier if they can avoid it, but sometimes they start feeling enough pressure, at least socially, that they feel they have to say something.
Well, and it is interesting because as soon as they step in, there are, of course, people who will say, that's curious. You have a problem with something going on in XYZ state, but yet your company is doing business around the world in nations where there are just horrific human rights abuses. So to Brad's point, it is a double-edged sword for sure, but it is a new dynamic. At least it is new to me. You know, Andy, in terms of fraud, Brad was talking about the issue of very little of it, which I think the data does bear that out. But we have had such a focus on the issue of absentee ballots and the mail-in date. And when you were doing your update on the different bills moving through the General Assembly, there's a focus on that postmark date. You know, when is a ballot valid and when is it not valid? Is that getting a lot of discussion in the General Assembly?
It is getting a lot of discussion in the General Assembly and outside of the General Assembly. They had some protesters out front of the General Assembly just this morning. We're talking about all the bills that I mentioned, but particularly that one. And so the big question here is what are the problems that you're trying to solve with these bills? Is the cure worse than the disease? And as far as this postmark bill, the big issue is what are the issues when you rely on a postmark instead of relying on saying it's your responsibility to get your ballot in by election day. North Carolina was with the majority of states until 2009 when they switched over to the postmark issue. And some of the issues, aside from people having concerns about folks figuring out a way to take advantage of this to cast a ballot after they know the results, for example, which we haven't seen particular evidence of that. There's issues of when the data comes in, when it gets reported. Obviously, you can't report on something on the results of a ballot until it's come in. Other issues revolve around the nature of the postmark. For example, in Wake County, we had an issue where they actually had to bring somebody from the post office to testify that he had accidentally stamped the wrong postmark on a group of ballots. And in fact, they did come in on the right day. We also had a lot of hearings in county boards where there were debates between the Paul Newby and Sheree Barry race for the state Supreme Court, where they were debating whether or not this ballot was in the mail stream or not in the mail stream. Should it be counted? Should it not be counted? And so, among other reasons, to add a sense of clarity about that thing is one of the reasons that they've decided to move back to having an election day deadline.
Well, there's one thing that I think's very important here. The process last year overall worked. I think about 25% of the total ballots counted were early absentee ballots. And the ballots were reviewed by both a Republican judge and a Democratic judge at the county office prior to when the application was made, and then when it was submitted back. So both parties had an ample opportunity to identify whether that was a valid voter or not. The system that was in place for absentee by mail vote worked in the state of North Carolina at the county level.
Even though this
worked in 2009 as well.
So it's fascinating to me that as we talk about the instances of actual fraud and the concern that people have and who has reviewed what and found to be a legally cast vote and that nothing was amiss, we still have a big time perception in this state that elections may not be free and fair next year. And I would just reference the March Civitas poll, which found that fewer than half of likely voters in this state, 49%, believe that next year's elections in North Carolina will be free and fair. A full 40% said no, the elections will not be free and fair in 2022. And you had 11% that were unsure. So Republicans communicated significantly more skepticism. I think that's understandable considering the time frame that we live in and what happened in the 2020 election and the narratives there. But
Donna, that comes from that comes from the big lie, and that's what the Republicans aren't willing to address. It is the big elephant in the room per se, is that Joe Biden won the election, and for Trump to continue to say that the election was rigged, it is undermining our democracy, and we have to accept that fact. one of the critical elements of our democracy is understanding and accepting the validity of our election system. And the biggest fraud that was perpetrated in the 2020 election was Donald Trump telling Republican voters that the election was rigged.
So do you think that that persists among the Republican electorate, that aside from this poll about elections in general, that there is a view?
And it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous to continue to undermine the authority and the acceptance of our election system. And the former president continues to do it.
Is there a difference? Is there a difference between that, undermining, which certainly I agree with you completely on that, but is there a difference between that and focusing on rules, perhaps changing rules, election rules in states after Election Day and what occurred there? I mean, are there still legitimate questions to be asked?
Yeah, no, there are I agree with you on that. There are legitimate questions to be asked. And the Democrats opened themselves up to agreeing to the consent agreement that Andy alluded to earlier that extended the rules and changed the rules without legislative consent. And that alarmed me here in the state of North Carolina. And what you saw because of COVID, election boards at the county level and at the state level across the United States were making the rules up as they went. And I think that is an element very legitimately that should be addressed.
Professor, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think, when you are changing the rules in the midst of playing the game, you ought to be playing Calvin ball. I mean, my son and I read Calvin and Hobbes cartoon strips, and Calvin ball is basically anything you want it to be, as long as you don't play by the old rules that you used to play by. And so when you have that kind of change, particularly as people are voting and going to vote, that certainly does call into question, I think properly in a lot of people's minds, what's going on, is the integrity of the system fair, and ensure that my vote will count. Unfortunately, North Carolina has also had dynamics in our very recent history of 2018 and the North Carolina 9th Congressional District race, and the issues that are still unresolved in terms of the allegations and the potential trial that's moving forward on that one. So I'm not surprised that certainly people are calling into question. I think, as Brad has noted and as I have noted, this tribalism that is very much dominated by national dynamics filtering down into state, even filtering down into local dynamics. We no longer have this kind of each state as an entity into its own, and North Carolina politics is different from South Carolina politics and Virginia. Yeah, we still have that, but so much of our political dynamic nowadays is driven nationally, and that has the influence all the way down the ballot, all the way down to the grassroots, that if the leaders at the top of the national dynamics, national parties are saying things, it takes hold very quickly in the grassroots and causes the issues that we are seeing today.
And that's what we saw after what happened in 2018. I remember there was an Elon College poll that I think it was close to 60% said they didn't have faith that the next set of elections would be free and fair, free of fraud. And the party dynamics there were a little different because of the people that were accused of the fraud. There were Republicans there in the 9th District that were accused of that. We're still waiting on a trial in that case. And so I think folks that feel that they've been wronged are more likely to blame the system. And so I think, like, for example, if we had taken a poll in Georgia right after the gubernatorial race of Stacey Abrams, there would probably be Democrats that would say the system was rigged against her. It's part of the natural course. I think this is maybe a little bit less in North Carolina than in some states, say Arizona, just because Trump happened to win in North Carolina. So that mollified some people. Now, there are some folks that say they can't get around their head how Donald Trump could win and Roy Cooper could win in the same election. But despite the nationalization of politics, we still have a fairly good amount of ticket splitting in North Carolina. That band's getting narrower every year, but we still have it. And so you can still have 4 Democrats winning statewide races while Republicans win the other 10 or so.
But it's nothing like 2004. I mean, I agree that the swing voters are shrinking. They still are oftentimes determinative. But if you go back to 2004, George W. Bush winning by 12, Democrat gubernatorial candidate Mike Easley winning by 12. We ain't going to see those kind of swings again in this state, in my estimation.
Right, and you had in that election, Dr. Bitzer, you had probably 16.5% of your Democrats roll over at the national level. They crossed over, and you're right. We will never see those. We're not going to see 16, 17% of your self-identified Democrats crossing over anymore. The level now for the Democrats is probably 8 to 9%. The Republicans probably about 3%.
So we've talked a bit about Donald Trump, and we know that he's already stepped into North Carolina with his endorsement of Congressman Ted Budd for the Republican primary in that U.S. Senate seat. We know that the National Democrats will be stepping into that race as well. What about Roy Cooper? You know, it's interesting. Again, the Civitas polls from the last several editions of that in 2021 have shown that people like Roy Cooper. He has a high job approval rating. It's above 50%, and we've gone through more than a year now of questions about the pandemic and how he's handled the pandemic, but he does well in the polling. So should Democrats feel good about that? Will he have an impact on what happens, not on just federal races, but on state races and the legislature, for example?
No, I don't see Roy Cooper having any coattails. The last governor for the Democrats to have coattails was Jim Hunt. And that's because Jim Hunt had an organization outside of the Democratic Party and could really impact local elections with his own organization. It was funny watching the focus group a couple of weeks ago. There was a lady in the group, and she said, Governor Cooper, he really doesn't do a whole lot, but he's a nice guy and he looks good on TV. And there was another voter who said, I think he's handled the pandemic really well, but they couldn't tell you anything that the governor has fought for. And, you know, he's got good name ID. I think he's done the best that he can do, but our state has always been a state where the legislature runs things pretty much, both from a fiscal standpoint and a policy standpoint. And I think the Republicans have made sure that they have their fingerprint on that policy and on our budget.
And Brad, I think you referred also to that focus group as folks saying that they felt pretty good about the legislative Republicans and what they were doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were giving the Republicans thumbs up. The proposal on the tax cut had just come out, and the unaffiliated voter in the wraparound counties around Charlotte was very excited about having another tax cut. They are worried about Medicaid expansion because there are fears with independent voters that they are going to end up paying that bill at some point in time in the future with an open-ended social program that basically takes money out of their pocket and gives it to somebody else. So they're very concerned about it. There was one comment in there that they felt like that uninsured patients should be able to see a doctor and they'd like to see some type of program there. So I don't know if there'll be any movement there or not. The other interesting thing to me, Donna, was the support, the growing distrust and I would say dissatisfaction with our public school system, and that the parents were very supportive of school choice policies, allowing them to send their child to the school that they want to, that they think is going to be the academic fit for their child. And that's a critical shift that I'm seeing in the public policy standpoint for education. And the last thing, no one knew either Josh Stein or Mark Robinson. So that tells me the governor's race in North Carolina in 2024 is going to be absolutely wide open.
You know, this is fascinating to me what you've revealed about that focus group, because when it comes to Medicaid and also defense of the traditional public school, those are very well-known, frequently heard Democratic Party talking points. I mean, our governor has talked about expanding Medicaid many, many times. He was just asked about it by a reporter when there was a few questions about the budget situation. So are Democrats then, or are they, or should they be concerned that they are losing out on what have been key public policy issues for them over the last several cycles?
Well, 27 years of my career was as a Democrat consultant. I'm unaffiliated now, and so I work for who I want to. But if I was advising the Democrats, I would tell them to be very worried, because the sands are shifting on them when it comes to two cornerstone issues on the public policy front, on Medicaid expansion and on public education.
You know, Professor, it's interesting. I know you study this historically. Are elected officials behind the curve? Is that just the way it works? Does the public attitude change first and then the politicians come second?
I think that we are in a transitional period. And what is always interesting to me and kind of always is floating in the back of my mind is a generational dynamic that we are seeing kind of play itself out in real time. We don't have the luxury of looking back over time, looking back over history to kind of see what it exactly ends up being. But I think that if you look at voters under the age of 40, they have, what I have seen from folks like Pew Research Center, very distinctive, very different dynamics particularly about the role of government versus those, say, over the age of 55, boomers. So millennials and Gen Zs versus boomers, kind of with folks that are in my cohort, Gen Xers being the bridge in between, is something that I think a lot of people are going to be looking at, and how particularly do candidates react to that kind of generational shift that's going on. You know, as Charlie Cook once said, we're all pre-dead. There's just some of us more pre-dead than others. And so we're going to have to think about how public opinion is looking at public policy issues like education, like healthcare, like a whole host of different dynamics, and see where those shifts are occurring. And if some generational elected leaders, older elected officials, are willing to respond, or are willing to lead, or are willing to say, you know what, my time is done. It's time to hand it over to a new generation.
Now, Dr. Bitzer's absolutely right there, Donna. And we were talking about trust in elections. When I look at research for the clients that I work with from independent expenditure or from a direct campaign, it is alarming at the growing number of younger voters who do not have any trust in government at any level, whether it's local, county, state, or federal. And they see it as more infotainment, and they don't see it as having a direct correlation or impact on their day-to-day lives. And so that sort of, that also leads to what I call the bunkering effect, where they register party and partisanship and don't necessarily look at it beyond that scope.
Sometimes I think it's all about the messaging as well, because now I'm actually starting to hear both sides of the political aisle talk about fairness and justice, and the term woke not only being applied to left of center now, that there is a woke right movement. So is that a new dynamic that you all are seeing, or is it just me?
I think that's been around for a while. If there's a term that works, that resonates with people, politicians are going to find a way to use it to define things in a way that's better for their side. I mean, I don't know if there's anybody that says I am the anti-justice candidate, for example. but they're going to try to define that term in a way that's the maximum benefit for them. I think you see that right now currently with some of the ongoing debate about, what is critical race theory? How do you define it? What does it mean? The Republicans define it fairly broadly, and they're saying this is what school boards are trying to push. Democrats and progressives are trying to keep that thing as narrow as possible based on the reactions that you've seen in some of these school board meetings. And I think that applies with other things. I think that the sides are kind of following similar lines that they've done for a while, but the terminology for what those things are do change.
I'd like to get back to the issue of the unaffiliateds if we could, just in general, and the registrations in North Carolina. We know that for decades and decades, this was a Democratic Party stronghold, and the Republicans have started kind of, I guess, roaring back, if you would like to put it that way, taking over the state legislature and taking a few of the statewide elected seats, and then we had a Republican governor. But now it seems like we got a lot of people who don't want to be associated with either of the major parties. Why is that, and what are the numbers looking like?
I think in terms of the first question, particularly why aren't voters under the age of 40 aligning themselves with a particular party registration? I think that they are the no labels generation, that they certainly see things and want the flexibility of it, but not to be adhered to in terms of the labels that both parties have now become sorted with. I mean, if you are a Republican, you are a conservative. There are not the liberal Rockefeller Republicans that perhaps we amongst this group once knew about. And then on the Democratic side, the Southern conservative Democrat has gone the way of the liberal Northeastern Republican, and the parties have basically sorted themselves. What I think is happening is that younger voters who grew up in the 1990s, the 2000s, into the 2010s saw the polarization increase and said, you know what? I don't want to be a part of the two parties warring at each other. I want an unaffiliated or an independent status. But when it comes to going into the voting booth, what we as political scientists know is, well, if they lean to one party or they lean to the other, they're voting just as much as with the partisans are. So, this dynamic of this mass moderate middle is really kind of what I would describe as faux independence, because 90% of them are going to be voting for the party that they lean to. And I think, in North Carolina, perhaps also nationally, we see the dynamics typically around 10, maybe 15% are true independent swing kind of voters. But those numbers have shrunk and continue to kind of decrease over time. And so with the rise of the unaffiliated voter, I always tell people that doesn't necessarily mean they're politically independent. And in some of the dynamics and the research from 2020 that I've been looking at, as you increase in terms of a precinct with more and more registered unaffiliateds, they tend to lean more Republican in this state. And so I think that dynamic certainly is there. It's there nationally. We are a microcosm of a lot of national narratives when it comes to voter behavior and partisanship. And we have basically sorted ourselves post 2008, 2010 elections, and we're kind of battling for that middle unless the two sides increase their own voters to show up at the ballot box.
And Dr. Bitzer brings up a really important point. There is a difference between the unaffiliated voter in Craven County and the unaffiliated voter in Mecklenburg County. And you got to know that. The one other thing that I think is really important is looking at the public policy effects of our state moving to unaffiliated voter status. They don't have access to the ballot. If you want to run for a local office as an unaffiliated voter in Wake County, you have to get 2% of your registered voters to sign a petition to get you access to the ballot. As we move, if you want to run for sheriff or you want to run for the state legislature, then you're looking at 4%. So that is a barrier that is way too high. in most of our counties across the state where you can get access to the ballot. And I fully anticipate before, as I live on this earth, hopefully for a few more years, that we will see litigation that challenges our barriers that the state has placed on unaffiliated voters to gain access to the ballot. And that may impact our party primaries somewhat, especially if the unaffiliated voters have an independent primary to identify the candidate that would run in the general elections. But I think we're going to see that clearly. We've got to give more access. If you want to hold the parties accountable in the state of North Carolina, let the unaffiliated voters have better access to the ballot.
Well, a couple of concerns. I guess my biggest one is, do unaffiliated voters represent any kind of coherent worldview that would be opposed to Democrats or Republicans? Because we just talked about how they're not really middle of the line voters. They tend to go one way or another. And I do tend to be concerned also about the practical administrative effects. Once you start making it easier, you're going to get a lot more folks registering, which is a good thing in some sense, but you're going to get longer and longer ballots on here. And I don't see the practical way to have
the ballot have to do with it? What does the length of the ballot have to do with it?
Length of the ballot, well, part of it is you're going to have increased roll off when you have longer ballots.
True.
That's the single biggest thing. And, it costs more once you get the ballots on, more than 1.5 page front and back. Now, I'm not saying necessarily you don't want to make it easier, but there has to be some hurdle you get through so that anybody doesn't just show up with $2 and say, I want to run for president. And then you have however many people want to do that. Now, I set that as an extreme example, but you got to try to find a balance on that.
Right. So as a Democrat, if I wanted to file for North Carolina Senate, I could go down, pay my $1,000 fee and get on the ballot, submit my paperwork and the ethics form, and you're on the ballot. Same thing for the Republicans. As an unaffiliated voter, you can't do that.
Well, now we can debate whether or not we want to have the government in the party primary business, but they are. And so that's the setup for them. But once again, we don't have an unaffiliated party. That's just people that has the same designation. So how are you going to have really a primary with those folks?
One last issue I want to get to before our time runs out today, gentlemen, and that is the new Congressional District. Brad, you referenced it up front with your comments, but what should we expect? Anybody know where this is going to be and what the timing could be on this?
I think Brad and Andy are more plugged in than I am here in Smallsbury, so I'll defer to what they're talking about. I think certainly the party in power is going to draw the maps to keep the party in power, and certainly the question is going to be how far can they push that. We've seen in the past here in North Carolina, chairmen of the redistricting committees, lo and behold, draw districts that happen to be over their legislative districts. And lo and behold, they decide to run for Congress. This is nothing new in terms of North Carolina politics. We'll just have to, from my vantage point here in Salisbury, let's let it play out and see what happens. But certainly the dynamics are going to be there to, benefit one party over the other.
Brad Miller drew him a seat in 2001 and held it for 10 years. So, I mean, it's not unprecedented. Nope. The Democrats have done it. I fully anticipate the Republicans will do it. And, I think more importantly will be what the maps look like for the legislature. I will say this in summary. The 3-judge panel 2 years ago gave the legislature good guidance on how to draw the maps. So the Republicans came back in and drew the maps. They had a fully vetted, transparent, accountable process to draw the maps. And I think you'll see that roll out again.
Gentlemen, it's been a fascinating discussion today as we get into the 2022 election season. Our guests today have been Dr. Michael Bitzer, Professor of Politics and History at Catawba College, Brad Crone, who is with Campaign Connections, and Dr. Andy Jackson, who is the director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity here at the John Locke Foundation. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Appreciate you joining me, and we're going to have you back because we know a lot more is going to happen as we head our ways towards 2022. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank
Thank you, Donna.
Thanks.
And folks, thank you very much for tuning in once again today to Shaftesbury Society. So glad that you were along. And remember that we also will be sending out a video of today's panel discussion, so you can watch for that as well. Be sure to share that with your friends and folks who weren't able to tune in here live from Midtown Raleigh. I would ask you to consider one thing before we say goodbye today, and that is this. If you like what you are hearing and seeing out of the John Locke Foundation, please do consider making a tax-deductible contribution to help fuel the work. We are a nonprofit organization, and it's very fast and easy to do. Just go to johnlocke.org. In the upper right-hand corner is that Donate tab. You just click that. Takes you less than 2 minutes to make that contribution to help fuel the work of this organization, and we would greatly appreciate your support. Hope you have a wonderful week. We want you to tune back in next Monday here again for another edition of Shaftesbury Society. On behalf of the entire John Locke Foundation team, I'm Donna Martinez. Have a great week, everyone.